Hello, brothers. My name is Dale Holland. I'm very honored to serve as your 50th National President for Phi Kappa Tau. I'm a 1987 initiate at the Beta Mu chapter at Kent State University in Ohio. Today, I'm going to take you on a journey that has spanned 20 years. While some of you weren't here or alive 20 years ago, I can assure you that I was, and this is my story of an event that unfolded 20 years ago on September 11th, 2001, a day when our nation was attacked. It's not a great story, but it's my story. As your parents and grandparents will tell you where they were when Neil Armstrong stepped on the moon, this is my generation's, where I was on that fateful day. I was a major in the United States Air Force, and I had just recently been assigned as a Navigator on Air Force One, an honor that is unbelievable to be offered a position to be a part of that air crew. I was a Navigator by trade in the United States Air Force when I got my commission in 1988, but the pinnacle for me as a Navigator was to be invited aboard the crew of Air Force One, and this happened to be my 5th flight on the aircraft on that day. We were in Florida. We took President George W. Bush to Jacksonville, Florida on the night of the 10th, where then we flew him from Jacksonville Naval Air Station to Sarasota Bradenton Airfield, where we spent the night in downtown Sarasota. That morning I woke up like any other day. The mission was to fly the president back from Sarasota back to Washington, D.C. In fact, I had met my sister and her husband at the time for breakfast there in Sarasota. They'd come up. They wanted to get a tour of the aircraft and get to see all my new colleagues and coworkers I'd be working with. The day started as a normal day, breakfast at a hotel, off to work. A little after 8, we were getting a tour of Air Force One, and we just got on board. My sister and her husband had took some pictures in front of the aircraft before the tour started, but we didn't know what the rest of the morning would bring. As we're getting a tour of the aircraft, we're up on the flight deck area, and one of the radio operators came up to me and said, "Hey, Major Holland, an airplane just hit the World Trade Center." And I looked at him and I was very puzzled, because when I was a kid, I remember a story of a bomber that had flown into the Empire State Building in like 1947 or 1948, and it hit like the 76th floor. And I'm thinking, I don't know if there's weather up in New York City that could have caused an airplane to fly into the World Trade Center. Lo and behold, I continued on the tour to my sister and my brother-in-law at the time, giving them a tour of the flight deck, navigator station, the pilot station, the flight engineers. And that time, a second radio operator came up to me and said, "Major Holland, we've had a second aircraft that struck the World Trade Center." At that time, I looked at my sister and I said, "Love you, but you got to go." I knew that the president would be returning to the airplane immediately for a return trip to Washington, D.C. In fact, by the time I escorted my sister and brother-in-law off the aircraft, we had to go through the crew entry doors at the lower part of the forward aircraft. I escorted her off and told her she needed to stand into the press area, which is a roped-off area just off the left wing of the aircraft. At that time, I said I have to go to work, and as I turned to walk up, my boss, Colonel Tillman, said, "Dale, it's time. We got to get ready to go. We're heading back to Washington, D.C. The president's en route, 5 minutes out." So I jumped into the seat, had everything loaded to go on a return leg to Washington, D.C., and as the president climbed aboard Air Force One, we sealed the doors and were ready for an immediate takeoff. At that time, we heard other rumors that there was an attack at the U.S. Capitol building. We heard there was an attack at the Pentagon. We heard there was a lot of attacks. We were told that we, on Air Force One, on the ground in Florida, was a target. In war and in unknown situations, there's a thing called fog that gets into the muddies the works. That day, the fog of war was very evident in our nation. Our nation had just ended a Cold War with the Soviet Union, or Russia now, that had gone on since the end of World War II. Peace had broken out, or so it seemed. That day, our job was to protect the presidency, not the individual office that holds that office as a president, but the office of the presidency. The United States has a constitution that you're very familiar with, at least I hope you are. If you're not, I challenge you to get smarter on it. It's very important as a citizen to learn the Constitution. But that's a different discussion for a different day. There are successors in line to take the presidency if something would happen to the current president. Obviously, you know about the Vice President, Speaker of the House, members of Cabinet, as they would step in as successors. Our job is to make sure the president is squirreled away as quick as possible in a safe position. As we took off out of Sarasota heading north, we got a notification that all the commercial traffic in the United States of America was grounded or being diverted to land immediately. An aircraft flying out of Miami, an American Airlines flight, never forget that, was turned to turn right and land immediately in Orlando. And the pilot said negative, American Airlines en route to Dallas today from Miami. And the controller said, not anymore, there's a national emergency and you are directed to turn right and land immediately in Orlando. An eerie calm came over the skies of the United States that day as we were climbing out of Sarasota, and we saw attacks on the TVs that we had on board and the World Trade Center starting to collapse. Obviously, we could not take the president back to Washington, D.C. with the unknown state of going on in the country. At that time, we were directed to start to fly over the panhandle of Florida and find another location for us to land, Air Force One. Colonel Mark Tillman came back from a meeting downstairs talking to the president and chief of staff about our plans. The president couldn't get back to Washington, D.C. right now. He needed to find out what was going on. Was it a terrorist attack? Was it a coup, which is impossible with the way our government's set up? But he was concerned about the health and wellness of his family, members of cabinet, and he needed to get a hold of them to make sure they were safe and sound. The challenge back then, cell towers were very limited in the country in 2001. I know you find it hard to believe since every one of you has two or three devices on them now that are hooked up to a cellular network. But at that time, it was a new technology. And the East Coast was completely out of whack with the usage of the cellular system and the telephone systems on the East Coast. Also, the World Trade Center was a major hub in the networks that controlled the East Coast of the United States at the time. So in Air Force One, our job, we were continuing to fly out west over the panhandle. The president said, I need to address the nation. So being an Air Force asset, we decided to land at Barksdale Air Force Base in Shreveport, Louisiana. Barksdale Air Force Base is a home of B-52 strategic bombers that sit a nuclear alert mission. We knew that would be the safest place at this time for the unknown situations going on in the nation for the president. As we descended into the Shreveport area, we were joined by two F-16 fighters that joined us from Ellington Airfield in Houston, Texas. They were told to scramble, and they were given a vector. They said, when you see your target, you will escort that target. And their reaction was, what's the target? And the controller told them, fly this vector, you'll see the aircraft, and when you see it, escort it. Two fighter pilots starting their day in Houston had no idea what was going on that day. They started their day just like I did in Florida. Now they're scrambled alert launched to be our wingmen that day. We landed in Shreveport. The president was immediately taken off the aircraft into a communication facility where he was able to make contact with his vice president, chief of staff, and to get a status of his family and get a status of all his cabinet members. At that time, he started to recall all his cabinet members. The Secretary of State at the time, General Colin Powell, who happened to be in South America on a business trip, he was returning to Washington immediately. The Vice President was under the east wing of the White House in the Presidential Emergency Operations Center, along with his staff. At that time, we had just found out that the Pentagon had been attacked. The hijackers had hijacked numerous aircraft in the Boston, Washington, D.C., and New York areas, and they had accomplished their deeds for that day. The president came back on Air Force One, and our job then was to take him to Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska. Offutt Air Force Base in Omaha is a headquarters for Strategic Command, which used to be Strategic Air Command under the Air Force days in the 50s. but is now a combatant command known as U.S. STRATCOM. That facility there is a 5-story plus underground bunker where the president was able to have secure communications with everybody he needed to get more intel on what had happened. So as we flew into Omaha, Nebraska, the local TV station, as I was stationed there in the 90s, I knew to turn on Channel 3, and there it was. There's a 747 landing at Omaha. And the cat was out of the bag that we had taken the president to Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska. The president immediately went down to the command center with the 4-star general that was assigned there. He was able to communicate with all his staff, and they assured him that the nation's capital was secure. And at that time, he just said, "It's time for me to go home. I need to get back to the capital." The president that evening was supposed to make an announcement at 7 p.m. Eastern about the horrific events of that day. As we waited to get the go-ahead to take off, we met the pilots from the F-16s out of Ellington Field. We met them at base operations at Offutt Air Force Base. And they continued to tell us their story and get as much fuel as they could. At that time, we were alerted that the president's ready to go. So we immediately rushed back to Air Force One to bring President George W. Bush back to Washington, D.C. on September 11th, 2001. As we took off out of Omaha, I'll never forget, this 747 aircraft weighing just under 1 million pounds was probably the fastest airplane I've ever flown on. The speed of sound is Mach 1.0. We were flying decimal 94 as we crossed the country. We were going so fast that the fighters that tried to take off and keep up with us from Offutt called ahead and asked us to slow down because they were burning too much fuel to try to catch up to us as we crossed the heartland of our nation. As we sped across the heartland, we were joined again with fighters coming off of out of Langley Air Force Base and Andrews Air Force Base, and coming out of Washington, D.C. to escort Air Force One back into D.C. As we slowed our descent into the National Capital Region, you see a smoldering building off to the left. It was the Pentagon. It had been attacked earlier in the day. As we turned south so we could line up our landing arrival in Andrews Air Force Base, we sent the fighters in ahead of us to land to make sure there's no other threats to the president. We landed at Andrews Air Force Base at 6:30 p.m. that day. The president departed the aircraft, climbed aboard Marine One for a visual flyover the Pentagon before he returned to the White House. The president addressed the nation that night. The day 20 years ago lives very fresh in my mind. The tragedy, the numerous souls that were lost. See, my brothers, you never know what today brings, nor tomorrow, but you always have to be prepared to do your best. As I mentioned to you, this is a story that took 20 years in the making. 10 years ago, I was asked to write an article for The Laurel, in which I did. And here's a copy of that article. I don't know if you can see that or not. At that time, there were 4 or 5 brothers remembering the day, and my story was remembering 9/11 from Air Force One. And that was written on September 11th, 2011. And it's just a sad day for all of us, especially those over here in the midst of all the calamity and chaos. Now, granted, I wasn't underground in New York City, the World Trade Center, and I can't speak for them. I wasn't trying to crawl out of the wreckage at the Pentagon, where I had other coworkers that were fighting for their lives to dig out of the smoldering building, to dig out. And I can't talk about the air crew in Shanksville and the brave souls that lost their life trying to defend that aircraft. But I'm going to ask you, my brothers, are you prepared to do your duty when the nation calls? Are you prepared to help your brother in need right now, wherever in crisis is around our country? I need you to step up, brothers. I need you to be a good wingman. I need you to be a good brother. When I started my term as National President, coined the phrase, brotherhood first, Phi Tau always. I'm here to tell you, brothers, I'm very proud of each and every one of you. And I hope and pray that none of you have to go through a day like September 11th, 2001. But if you do, do the best you can, and always give it your all. And remember that your brothers are here for you, supporting you, and are be here with you through thick and thin. This fraternity experience that you're going through right now is not a 3 or 4 year stint. It's a lifelong commitment. And I want you to be the national president in 25 or 30 years from now. I want you to take care of your brothers and help in this organization. I respect you. I value you. I cherish your brotherhood. And if I could ever be of any assistance to any of you, please let me know. The 20th year is now, the blink of an eye. And here I sit telling my story of September 11th, 2001, 20 years later. Thank you, my brothers. Please take a moment of silence today to remember those that aren't with us today. I pray you never have to go through this, but if you do the best you can, and remember, your brothers are proud of you. Thank you, sirs. Have a good day.